Hey everybody, Jonathan Broadbent here, your host of UnWoke Academy, and as promised, I have with me today Justin Bernier from National Security Index. I've been telling you about them for a couple of weeks now. I did a little teaser Substack post roughly a week ago. I'm excited to have Justin. He recently actually was on NASDAQ and rang the bell for National Security Index. Justin, can you introduce the UnWoke audience to National Security Index?
Yes, Jonathan, thanks for having me. National Security Index, ticker NSI, and we're emerging markets without the bad guys. So think Chinese defense firms, sanctioned human rights abusers. We give you an institutional quality exposure to EM without those bad actors so that you can sleep at night knowing that you're not harming national security and putting Uyghurs into death camps, basically.
And it's refreshing to know that there's somebody that's actually starting off with the intention, with the objective of jettisoning the bad guys. You and I actually have had some conversations in the past over the last few months about the Chinese Communist Party and their military aspirations or inspirations. I think it's inspirations.
Maybe they're an inspiration to some.
Tell us about your positions and what you've discovered relative to the Chinese military.
Yeah, well, right now, if you want to invest in emerging markets, you have two choices. It's all China or no China. And we said, all right, if we're going to be institutional, there's going to be some China exposure, but let's make sure that we're only using the benign companies. Now, the companies that we're pulling out, a lot of folks have to don't know this, is that just because a company is sanctioned, and just because it's been identified as a Chinese military company does not mean that there are restrictions on outbound capital. Just the opposite. Most of the companies that are in the PLA value chain, most that have been identified as Chinese military companies by the Department of Defense, or that have been flagged by the Department of Commerce because they're defense companies looking for U.S. technology and they've been cut off from technology, they are still plenty of U.S. capital that's going into these companies from overseas. Now, there's a few hundred of these actually. We pulled them out. They range from anything like China State Shipbuilding Corporation, which makes the aircraft carriers. You have subsidiaries of AVIC, which is the fourth largest defense conglomerate in the world. They make the fighter bombers. There's a couple of companies that make China's nuclear weapons that produce the fissile material. And in a lot of cases, these are subsidiaries of companies that have been officially sanctioned by the Department of Treasury, but are not on any other type of restrictions for outbound capital. So you look across the PLA value chain, across the modernization program of the People's Liberation Army, and you're going to find companies that are sitting inside of the big index funds, the BlackRocks of the world, the Vanguards, the State Streets. Yep. These are index funds that control 85% of the capital out there. So it's an oligarchy, really. But those companies aren't using any type of screens to pull those out. Now, I'm focusing on defense companies, but there's also a lot of other bad actors that aren't technically defense firms that do things like espionage, that are involved in influence operations, that are building up the South China Sea artificial reefs and islands that the PLA is going to use to try to keep the U.S. Navy out of the area. So we have 9 different screens that identify these companies, but the Chinese military ones, that's a big chunk of what we've removed, and there's hundreds of them inside of the big index funds.
Exactly the stuff that we want to avoid. I recently became aware of a U.S. manufacturer that for many years, I think decades, was making some significant piece of military apparatus for the U.S. Navy. And some years ago, decade-ish, the U.S. Navy found out that they could get that same thing cheaper from China. Well, they gradually weaned down and stopped producing that thing in the U.S. and outsourced the production of this fundamental ingredient. It's critical to the operations of our U.S. Navy. And suddenly, lo and behold, poof, over the last couple of years, that China has sort of scaled back their willingness to produce on schedule and calls the entire thing into question. Suddenly, the U.S. is scrambling to bring back manufacturing of that sort of thing. I don't know that that's directly related to emerging markets and the work that you guys are doing, but it occurs to me as you describe, and I've watched that great video that you have on your website, and that is, again, nationalsecurityindex.com, all one word, nationalsecurityindex.com. I'll put it in the show notes for anybody interested. Click there, there's a little video that speaks to military. Not that military is the only piece of the puzzle here for emerging markets. I'm sure that there's more, and maybe you'll touch on what else you get into. There's a lot of saber rattling internationally right now. In an era of that, we would be ridiculous as a nation not to pay attention to where our money is going. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, we allowed a big part of our own military's value chain to get exported, and in the early 2000s, you actually had parts of Navy acquisition that were suggesting that we have ships built in China, and China State, ship construction, they're the largest shipbuilder in the world, CSSC, and they are the PLA Navy's main builder. Plenty of the companies, by the way, that are subsidiaries of that company are inside of those big index funds that we're talking about. But we've gotten better over time, and this is mostly through the efforts of the Department of Commerce. There's a Bureau of Industry and Security, of preventing certain Chinese companies from getting access to advanced technology. We are far from perfect on that, but a lot better than 5-10 years ago. The problem is the very companies that are restricted from accessing advanced U.S. technology that can be used by the PLA have almost no capital restrictions. So it's completely insane if you think about it. And those companies, of course, they're not restricted from getting involved on a business level with companies that have access to advanced technology. So you have technology controls without capital controls. And that's just not going to work because the two are hand in hand. Now, unfortunately, capital controls are really the domain of the Department of Treasury, which has historically been dominated by Wall Street executives. Go back and look at all the heads of the department, and you even go down to the undersecretary level, assistant secretary level. It's a revolving door from Wall Street. Companies like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan are usually the dominant ones there, but others make their way in as well, Morgan Stanley and such. So they have no incentive whatsoever to start cutting off capital. And at the same time, you have Goldman Sachs and BlackRock and others that have formed joint ventures with China. So you're not going to be able to go, leave Treasury and go back to your job at Goldman Sachs if you shut down those type of relationships. So I don't think this problem is going to get solved unless we have real strong leadership from the president about this. Congress is not going to solve it either, by the way. They're completely bought off.
One of the things that I've said often in my conversations around BlackRock and other sort of Wall Street types of firms, and yes, I know we can sort of get into the weeds in defining Wall Street, but it had sort of a general perception. And for a long time, through our lifetime, and certainly far before in our parents' and grandparents' era, Wall Street had kind of a panache to it. And I've made the argument recently, Justin, and I'd like your perspective on this, that Wall Street isn't Wall Street anymore. It seems to me, and I've made this argument for several years now, that Wall Street has really turned its back on America. And specifically, I've heard from some investment managers who are on the record saying that they wouldn't even consider investment in U.S. companies. They look to places specifically like China. What are your thoughts on sort of Wall Street as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about the guy that's selling, the small RIA. He's got, 100 clients and he's helping them retire. That's not Wall Street anymore. We're talking about billionaires in some cases, corporate executives in New York who are so far, in other places, obviously, not just New York, Chicago, the big cities, and they're spreading out across the country. So Alliance Bernstein moved into Nashville. We're talking about people that really are not connected in any way, shape, or form to the American people. And their kids are not going to join the military. They're not worried about these type of things, and they are really have more in common with their counterparts in Shanghai and in London and such. And so you see, the example of BlackRock, they have a joint venture with China Construction Bank. And that's really the future of BlackRock. I mean, I think the way that Wall Street executives look at the American population, we're kind of saturated with product. They've maxed everybody out. Anyone that can contribute to a 401k is. Everyone that has their investment accounts is there. There's not a lot of growth there. So they're looking overseas. And China is one of those places where there's a tremendous amount of growth because traditionally the Chinese have invested in real estate. Well, the Chinese government's completely destroyed that market. And so what they've done is they've partnered with Western asset managers, Goldman in particular, JP Morgan, BlackRock. They're letting them in and selling mutual funds that are then funneling cash to the mainland stock exchanges, Shanghai and Shenzhen, which have had big outflows recently. So they had to follow something up to get capital over there. And they're using BlackRock and the big US asset managers to do it, partly because they do have that panache. They still have some credibility, more credibility than the Chinese government when it comes to investors, but they know how to do it also. So this particular deal, BlackRock and China Construction Bank, where BlackRock is ostensibly the 51% owner, but they rely on the Chinese government to access mainland China retail investors. So they do this through 14,000 branch offices of China Construction Bank and their online portal. Chinese retail investors buy stocks through the banks. And China Construction Bank is the second biggest bank in China, second biggest in the world. And that's the future of BlackRock. So if that's your future, it's pumping, it's getting all these new retail Chinese investors, millions upon millions, and funneling that money into mainland stock markets, the stock market, where all these bad actors are. Are you going to start throwing out companies inside of your U.S. domiciled funds? You're not going to do that. You don't want to rock the boat, and you don't want to draw attention to the fact that you're financing these companies not only with the U.S. domiciled funds, but now the funds that they're selling on mainland China. It's a real problem. There's a merger going on right now of Wall Street and China. It's accelerating. We haven't seen anything like this before.
The way that I look at it, we, to a very large extent, we're actually funding our own demise. I mean, we're putting money into things like 401k, 403b, IRA accounts, and brokerage accounts, and the overwhelming majority of which not just simply leans left. And we can define that as your Disney and Target types of investments, the globalist bent, et cetera. But very specifically, as you pointed out, Justin, frequently we're funding things that have military implications, that are seeding a clearly growing and aspirant military in the Chinese Communist Party. And as they do things like create military bases and threaten places like Taiwan, they're clearly growing. And for us to be putting money in, or allowing our money, I should say, to be diverted into those initiatives is just, it's ludicrous.
Yeah, it's completely crazy that we're doing it with US money. And it's frankly crazy that the US government is allowing BlackRock and others to do it with Chinese money. These funds that they are selling in China, which are financing not only the known Chinese military companies, but the advanced technologies. That's where all that is. Ultimately, the fees that BlackRock is collecting is going to benefit the parent company back in the United States, which arguably is a violation of sanctions on some levels, because that money is going into many companies that are known, sanctioned by the Treasury Department, off limits to U.S. capital. There's only about 3 dozen, but they're there. So we have to ask ourselves: is Washington doing any oversight over the offshore activities of the big asset managers? Now, this is important because these aren't just, we talk about BlackRock and JP Morgan. These aren't small companies that don't have an impact on United States policy. These are actually like almost parts of the government at this point. JP Morgan is considered pretty much like a government. They're too big to fail, first of all. I mean, they're effectively like a government-run utility. BlackRock manages, advises on the thrift savings program, which is a 403b, the largest defined contribution plan in the world. They're a huge advisor to the U.S. government as well as the Chinese government. I mean, BlackRock officials we talked about being in the administration, but they're also huge advisors to the Federal Reserve, especially when there's a crisis. Well, if their biggest business partner right now is the Chinese Communist Party, what's going to happen when there's an issue that has to be sorted out in Washington? And you're going to see the type of pressure we've seen in the past, and BlackRock is going to come lobby for them. And they've done this before, such as with trade during the Trump years. So this merger of Wall Street and Beijing goes beyond the funding of bad actor companies. It gets to, are we going to be able to operate Is the government going to be able to operate in the best interest of the United States, or is it going to be undue influence from Wall Street executives who want to maintain those relationships in China and bring in big time management fees and big time growth, so they can expand their empire even more? BlackRock's got $10 trillion, $10 trillion under management. How much more when they're done with China? How big do they need to be? And their executives would say they need to be bigger. And that's where most of their growth is going to come from in the future.
And as you pointed out, it's not simply the fact that China in the Chinese Communist Party, however indirectly, is a key partner of BlackRock. It's that BlackRock, of course, sees where the potential growth for the future is. And so as BlackRock, even if we were on par, if BlackRock's work with and for the US government was equal in some way, that scale would inherently automatically tip in favor of the country of China, and then indirectly the Chinese Communist Party, because the two are intertwined, because BlackRock has to be seeing where the future growth is. As you pointed out, we've got sort of a saturated and very mature market in the US. But at what point do we, the people, simply just put our foot down and say, no, enough? And I've been saying from the beginning, and it's the reason that I started with a report on BlackRock almost 2 years ago now, August 4th of 2022, that exposed BlackRock and just a lot about BlackRock, a lot of the mislabeling, a lot of the kind of smoke and mirrors about how they present their investments, et cetera. But I want to turn that into a question and sort of a clarifying point. I read recently, within the last about 6 months, I think it was BlackRock alone that referenced a fresh, and I want to say it was around 4.63 billion net new flows, net new US dollars into communist China. That tells me where their focus is and where BlackRock is, and it's not just BlackRock. As you pointed out, there are a number of different Wall Street firms out there that are clearly leaning into the direction that is counter to U.S. interests, China included. But $4.63 billion of U.S. retirement funds going into communist China, that's incredibly harmful.
Yeah, is this the congressional report, Gallagher's committee, I think the China committee?
I think it came from that. It was actually a news report that I read, not the actual news coverage of the report. Right.
So one company, it is a bit more expansive than that. I mean, but especially when you look at all the other asset managers that are out there, Vanguard is a huge problem in this respect. And we think about Vanguard as this nice company that helps average Americans get low management fees. They have more exposure to China A shares. So these are the stocks traded on the mainland, and these Chinese military companies than any other company, even BlackRock. So it's really at the tip of the iceberg. This doesn't even get into the offshore funds. So Gallagher's committee did a really good job looking at U.S. domiciled funds. But remember, BlackRock is multinational. Not only do they have an office, a business in Shanghai, a subsidiary, but they're all over the world, Europe, Australia, so on and so forth, all parts of Asia. Those funds that they control are also investing in China and in these bad actors. So when you look at their funds, their fund family across the globe, it's the U.S. is one part of it. It's a huge part of it, yes, but there's also they also have fund companies in Europe and Japan, and this stuff is just flowing capital into the Chinese stock market, which is really like an incubator for these Chinese military and advanced technology companies that are going to fuel the PLA modernization. They keep these companies in Shanghai, on the Shanghai Exchange in Shenzhen, because there's no accountability, there's no auditing, they don't have to play by the same rules, and so it's a one-way street, one-way capital. They can cut off that capital, the outbound. They can cut off the sales. We've seen them shut down the stock market before. It's a perfect setup for them, and there's really no adult in the room. It's the Wild West. All of this stuff, it's amazing. And so think about this from Beijing's perspective. They're getting these huge capital flows from Wall Street, from BlackRock, Vanguard, et cetera. There's no There's no auditing. There's no oversight. There's no accountability. They can turn off the outbound money anytime, and they get a business partner in BlackRock and in JP Morgan that can affect U.S. policy. They can pick up the phone anytime, China Construction Bank, which is a CCP controlled organ. It's a state bank. They can call their business partner in New York, and they can turn on that lobbying machine for whatever purpose they need. And it doesn't have to be an official lobbying where there's, people are filling out forms and disclosures, but there's a pressure over time. Where BlackRock stands on an issue over time is very important. And members of Congress are terrified of this company. They really are. They're terrified of the big banks because when they start turning on campaign contributions, it can have a material effect on their careers.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm going to introduce an element that I'm hopeful that it proves relevant to our conversation. It's something that I know only a little bit about, and it's sort of a categorical knowledge and not anything very specific. But it seems to me that if anybody knows and understands, maybe you do, it's my understanding that that China for a long time has received, I think the term is preferred nation status. And for that reason, and sort of being categorically held in stasis in this quasi category of emerging market, that they receive significant financial benefits. Do you know much about that, and does that come into play?
Well, most favored nation status, it doesn't come into play so much when we're talking about these capital flows from funds, but it is a tool that the U.S. government can use. It's really a tool that's kind of off the table at this point. We are so far down the road in terms of the economic concessions we've made to China on basically across the board. And I think that was a big part of the backlash against Trump from Wall Street, right? They saw what he was trying to bring accountability to that economic relationship, and they fought it at every turn. During the trade negotiations, there was this is reported in the Wall Street Journal. You had a closed door meeting, effectively with the heads of the big banks, including Larry Fink and all these other characters. They came in, and at the time that the Chinese official Ministry of Finance, he said, "Hey, I need your help with the trade deal, and in exchange, we're going to open up our market to your products." And you look at the timeline of that meeting and the trade deal, and then when China started allowing mutual fund companies to be set up by foreign corporations on mainland China, and it started out slowly, but then you saw after the fund companies were set up, they were allowed to be wholly owned, and then you had these joint ventures being formed. The joint ventures, that was always the end goal of BlackRock. BlackRock knows that it can't just go into China, set up a shop at the local mall and start selling mutual funds. You need buy-in from the Chinese government. You need access to the financial infrastructure of the regime to sell financial products. And they got that. And it took a few years. But that's why they're so rabidly pro-Beijing on so many of these issues on Wall Street, and it's not going to change. It's going to get worse. And so we have to be very careful. This is going to be a very trying 10-year period or so with U.S.-China relations. It's not getting less tense, right? The stakes are getting higher across the board. And you have effectively in Wall Street a business partner of Beijing. Wall Street also happens to be, if not number one, they're number two most powerful political influence in the world, maybe big tech being number one. So this is a strategic problem. And people are afraid to talk about it. We briefed, I won't name the committee, but the staffers, the second they hear BlackRock, they go quiet. They do not, and I'm not talking about the China committee here, but you start talking about some of these other committees of jurisdiction. They are genuinely afraid to take on that machine. It's extremely powerful. So we don't think the problem is going to get solved in Washington. It's going to have to happen at the RIA level, with advisors, investors, state pensions. State legislatures are going to have to stand up and say, "Hey, look, we're not trying to pretend that China doesn't exist. We know they're here, and we know that our institutional or our clients are going to need long-term exposure to all emerging markets. But we got to do it in a smart way. And that means taking out these bad actors systematically. And that's what we're doing.
Well, now you're talking my language, because just for the edification of my audience, you've probably heard me talk about it before, but I'm going to define RIA. RIA is a type of financial services firm. It's called a registered investment advisor. And in spite of the last word, the term advisor being in there, it's actually a type of company. It doesn't refer to an individual. So RIAs have grown in popularity and commonality all across the US over the last decade or so. And they're, generally speaking, you're referencing an independent financial advisor. There are some exceptions. It gets a little bit nuanced. But when Justin's talking about RIAs, he's talking about the types of firms that I established a little over a decade ago. And my firm, and I want to get into the sweet spot here and some of the cool, exciting things that I see starting to happen within the US to fight back against this woke left nonsense. And that has to do with retirement plans, because let's face it, I am a huge advocate of individuals taking the reins of financial choices and understanding the implications of where their money is going. And Justin, if you haven't heard me say this before, we adopted a term from our friends at Second Vote before we've acquired the intellectual property and assets of Second Vote, and plan on launching and relaunching that into an app, etc. But one of the cool terms that they came up with is vote your values. And there's another sort of a memory hook that we call the globalist left, and that stands for know where you donate, invest, and spend your money. Because if you don't, it can come back and haunt you. So I sort of draw the parallel to the world of politics. You've all probably heard that expression, you may not care about politics, but politics cares about you. And the same thing happens in the world of finance. A lot of what we're talking about here today is designed to be sort of off radar for your average person. And it ends up allowing for some bad actors to funnel trillions of dollars into bad investments that are harmful to us. But that's where the light is. The light at the end of the tunnel, that sort of wonderful fast fix to this. I shouldn't say fast fix, but a potentially great lever for us to be pulling is large pools of money in things like 401k and state retirement plans. You probably heard me talk about things like 457 plans. Things like those are large pockets of money, and we're actually starting to see some lawsuits, like the American Airlines Pilots Union and New York City Workers Unions, who are suing for use of things like ESG and far left manipulation of those pockets of money. So Justin, are you following those as well? Are you as excited about those turns of events as I am?
Yeah, it's part of a groundswell. It's a democratization, let's say, of finance, where they're realizing that they can no longer count on controlling these huge pots of money. And Larry Fink had a temper tantrum the other day when I think it was Texas decided to throw out some of their assets and complain, it's not that bad, we're misunderstood. Well, we've had a few years now of ESG being an issue, and we're seeing that it's being used as a bludgeon. I mean, they're using it to get their way, and a big part of this whole business model of Big Wall Street is control. I mean, these are kind of control freaks, right? I mean, some of them been compared to Bond villains. I'm not so sure they're as cool as Bond villains. I mean, most Bond villains know how to use a handgun, right? But that would violate their ESG rules. So, they kind of have that sort of, maniacal megalomania to them. Well, the proxy votes are the same overseas. They get control basically through these indices of huge parts of huge portions of the stock markets of these companies. Well, that gives them a lot of sway in those countries with those governments. These are multinational operations, and I think at some point the U.S. government needs to step into this and say, look, it's just too big. You shouldn't be controlling 40% of the world's stock. We're going to have to break up these companies. We're going to have to break up. We're going to have to divorce the foreign domiciled fund companies from the parent companies here, and maybe even think about breaking them up, within the United States itself, because it's just too much power. It was never, index investing was never designed to be a way for 2 or 3 companies to control the entire world. But that's where this is headed. And it certainly wasn't, when John Bogle came up with the index, or promoted the index concept to the max, he certainly wasn't thinking that it was a great way for the Chinese government to make inroads in Washington and to buddy up with some of the most powerful companies in the United States. So we have to take a huge strategic look at this, but that groundswell is where this is going to start. And I think once the states really dig into this, we will see more and more. The people get confidence that, hey, wait, we can take on BlackRock, we can take on Vanguard, State Street, some of these other big companies, and we can force them to do what's best for the investor. Because right now they're doing what's best for themselves.
Yeah, that's exceptionally well put, and I'm going to take advantage of that segue to put a shameless plug in for my most recent episode, How to Proxy Vote the Right Way. That's the episode I just released prior to this one. I'm just going to briefly interject for reference for our clients so I can tease this out the right way and hopefully encourage you to go back one episode and watch How to Proxy Vote the Right Way. When you own a mutual fund, exchange traded fund, or you have stocks in your portfolio, however you own small shares of companies anywhere in the world, you are given the right to vote on key issues within that company. That can quickly and easily disappear in the busyness of life. And I think a lot of people who are your average rank and file investors, especially through things like a workplace retirement plan or an IRA, it can sort of get out of sight, out of mind very quickly. And there are easy avenues for you to outsource that voting. But just keep in mind that the results of those voting, the voting of boards of governance, the board of directors of companies, whether or not to include ESG, a lot of those issues are voted on, and you probably are sitting on a gold mine of votes that might be steered in a bad direction. That said, go back and watch the episode. I talk at length about how we can organize to fight back and bring the voting back at least sort of middle of the road and not so far left. I don't want to spend inordinate amounts of your time exclusively focused on China. It just happens to be particularly interesting to me because I follow China pretty closely and their human rights violations, what's happening with the abuses of Uyghur in China, etc. So I don't want to monopolize our time just on one country. So I am going to ask you to talk about the scope of countries in which you look and invest and might potentially invest, but also, before we completely move on from China, would you talk a little bit about patent abuses that you may see in China?
Well, I mean, intellectual property theft is a tremendous problem. I mean, the United States Trade Representative Office tracks this. It's not an extremely powerful office, but it's one of these things that the government's kind of given up on. And, you know, most Americans don't spend their day looking at the Federal Register that comes out every day with all the notices and whatnot. But there are, on any given day, tons of complaints that go through the process. It's a daily type of issue in the bureaucracy. It's out of sight for certain, but it hasn't been something that the U.S. government has decided to get really tough on with China. Just as we haven't gotten really tough on the illicit transfer of technology. You know, we have the Bureau of Industry and Security does some of that, but it's not enough. You know, you mentioned the Uyghurs. We have a list. It's called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act Entity List. Congress some time ago, not that long ago, said if you are a company in China and the multi-agency, interagency process determines that slave labor is being used or the company is being used in that campaign of genocide, which, you know, we're talking about millions of people in slave camps, millions of people that are being affected by this. If your company is using slave labor for a product, you cannot sell that product in the United States. And so Department of Homeland Security maintains that list because it has to do with customs and border enforcement. So we do have a pretty sizable list of these companies. Now, there are no outbound capital restrictions, though, to these very companies. So they can't sell anything in the United States, but you can send them as much capital as you want. And Big Wall Street's doing that. So it's just another example of this kind of confused government policy that we have in general towards China, where it's very piecemeal. There's nothing integrated about it. And the intellectual property issue has been lost in that. That should be first and foremost. That should be right up there as a top issue, because we're a company that we invent things, right? We're inventing things all the time. And China swoops in, of course, and takes it. And a lot of their military platforms are based on intellectual property theft. They've come into our programs, they've stolen things, they've taken it back, and they forego billions of dollars of R&D. And then so you see them deploy their new fighters. They look just like the Joint Strike Fighter. Their Humvee made by Dongfeng Motor Group looks exactly like our Humvee, made by General Motors. And so you're starting to see their military looks a lot, platform to platform looks a lot like ours, because they have built it on U.S. technology, stolen U.S. technology, and sometimes just outright purchase technology.
Yes. Let's talk about where you look, what countries you have in the portfolio now, and maybe don't have, but would consider for the future.
Yeah, well, it's, our exclusion process focuses on China and Russia. Russia's not really an issue right now, right? Because all those stocks have been thrown out of U.S. capital markets. Eventually, they'll probably come back in. We'll be ready when that happens. But in terms of investing, we've got a broad EM exposure. Bigger positions include those in Brazil, India, Indonesia. These are exciting places because right now, U.S. stocks are very expensive. So let's say they're around, 24 price to earnings in general, whereas emerging markets are around 12. So about half the price. At the same time, you have a very expensive dollar that is starting to decline in relative value. And that's very good for foreign stocks. And then you've got, on top of that, where is GDP? Where is the future growth going to be? Where are people having kids? Now, that's not, China has been a demographic disaster, but other places like India and Indonesia are not. And so, we saw emerging market stocks really shine in that period from, like, let's say 2000 to 2009 or so, with a crash. And then we went back to U.S. leadership. And I think we're going to see international being the hot place to be over the next 5 to 10 years, because we're seeing that cycle repeat itself. Now, where do you go for international? I don't think Europe and Japan are good bets. Those can be nice trades depending on what's happening with the yen, but there's no people being born in these areas. They're almost deindustrializing in parts of Europe, which is really sad to watch, but this is what's happening. I don't see any big stock market booms happening in Europe for quite some time, but we will see it in places like India and probably Brazil. And so we're in those places. And as a result of us being underweight China, let's say we're at 20% China, but you're going to see, the big asset managers can be anywhere 25 to 40% because they've loaded up so much on mainland stocks. We're underweight China, but we're going to have exposure to those places that I've mentioned that look to be the big growth areas over the next, say, 5 to 10 years.
What about South America? Are you seeing anything exciting in South America?
Yes, Brazil. Now, Brazil is a problem from a political perspective right now.
Yep.
And we've contributed to that, in my opinion, the U.S. government has. But there is great potential there. Now, Charles de Gaulle once said, Brazil has great potential and always will. But that was in the past. They have obviously developed immensely since the 60s and 70s. There's a dynamic population there. There are robust businesses. There is, although it does have its problems, when you look across the world, I would argue Brazil has fewer of those type of problems that you might worry about in terms of rule of law at the business level and that sort of thing. So I think there is a place for Brazil. Now, you don't want to be 50% of your international in South America. That's just not loading up on like Chile and Colombia, and those should be small allocations in an EM portfolio of 1 to 2%. But Brazil can be 10 to 15% based on its GDP and where it's going. India is going to be a big factor going forward. I think that's the next 20 years. And this has been reflected a bit in the stock movement over the past few years. People have been really interested in India. And India is a tough place to invest. It's a bit of a closed system. The government there does not like the idea of a lot of foreign capital because in their experience, that capital, that's hot money that can leave very quickly and have a profound impact on the financial infrastructure of the country. But that's going to change over time. I mean, you have more and more Indians living abroad. There's a lot of crossover with capital. Companies are getting more involved. Think about Infosys and such. It's not an autarkic situation anymore. They are becoming more and more part of the global economy, and that's going to be more global capital. So I would look for India. And then Indonesia is kind of a sleeper, if you will, but because of the demographics there and the development that we're expecting, that ought to be a significant part of an EM exposure, call it 4 or 5, even 6%. And I think you'll see that over the next couple of decades. Indonesia will become one of the bigger pieces of EM exposure.
So, yeah, a lot of these countries, when we talk about India, I mean, that's been at play and talked about pretty openly and regularly in global markets for, I want to say, at least 15 years, and as part of what people came to think of as BRIC, or then eventually BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So that shouldn't be news to anybody that the considerations of India. And I think that is really starting after 15 plus years to really kind of cement itself in the psyche of your average investor. I'm going to interject a few things because I want to make sure that we touch on these before we end our time today. And they have to do with a report that came out recently that you actually were kind enough to bring to my attention. This is a white paper report. It's a case study for Congress on how Wall Street's offshore companies fund the CCP and PLA. And there is another piece that I'd like to ask you to comment on, and that's a news article from the Washington Times. And I'll put both of these in the show notes when I post this video. This one is a really sort of an explosive, eye-catching title. BlackRock in China, nuclear buildup underwritten in part by leading Wall Street firm, report says. I understand that you're familiar with, and possibly intimately familiar with, these two pieces. Can you comment on these?
Yeah, Coalition for a Prosperous America, done great work on this. I mean, the title says it all, right? You have, if you're investing in these products, you're actually sending money over to companies that are making China's nuclear weapons. So they're in the middle of a big buildup of nukes. In the past, we've had a handle on the Chinese nuclear capability. They had about 20 ICBMs. They were liquid fueled, meaning they would have to gas them up before they launched, and we knew where they were because they were fixed locations, and we could take them out if we had to. Today, that's not the case. They're building lots of ICBMs, many of them mobile, so very tough to track. The Russians did the same thing the Soviets did back during the Cold War. They're building more Chinese, the Chinese are building more ballistic missile submarines, also with capital from the United States. So these would be very difficult to detect. They're capable of launching ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads. You're getting MIRVed warheads, meaning they can hit multiple targets from one warhead. So that improves the number of warheads they can put on target in any type of situation. So their survivability is going up. They're creating more warheads. They're building more survivable warheads. At the same time, their accuracy is improving. And don't forget, we gave them the technology on how to launch ballistic missiles. It's when we transferred to them technology on how to launch satellites. So a lot of this is their own technology. We know it works, so we have to be very careful about this. But they are ramping up construction of the warheads, and they're doing that through largely through two particular companies, one of which is making the plutonium with breeder reactors. So a breeder reactor throws off more fissile material than you need to actually operate the power plant. And that material is then used in the warheads. And so there's two companies in particular that are being funded by Big Wall Street. It's a problem. And you know, we look down the road 5-10 years from now. You know, in the 80s, when I was growing up, there's no shortage of nuclear weapons, right? You never thought the United States would run out of nukes. Like, you had tens of thousands of them. The way the media talked about them, they were, you know, around every corner, and we were spending oodles of money on it. Well, we don't do that anymore. Our nuclear deterrent is actually degrading because we haven't really put any money into it. And it's a lot smaller than it was, in part because of arms control, but in part because, you know, these weapons are not made to last forever. They're made with nuclear material. It degrades the components and everything. So we're getting a situation where our nuclear deterrent is degrading. They're quickly ramping theirs up. And you think about what kind of situation is that going to create globally? How's that going to change the geopolitics? So that's a big issue. It's not really something that investors should worry about day to day, in my opinion. But geopolitically, it's, you know, and it's entitled of that newspaper article. I think the reporter did a smart job of pulling that out and drawing attention to it, because it really captures the essence of this capital flow problem. We are sending capital over to China that is creating strategic problems for us, whether it is them building up conventional weapons, a nuclear deterrent that could be used to hold U.S. cities at risk, or capital that's going into business relationships between Wall Street and the CCP that are going to create political problems in our process, in our political process here. These are all like strategic problems. You know, it's not small ball. We're way beyond like, hey, this company stole this widget, and you know, they haven't given them, you know, they stole the IP and they're selling it back here, and fake purses and things like that. These are like really big issues. Congress really, they just can't bring themselves to tackle it because the donations are so big from these entwined interests. And so we're going to have it's going to have to happen at the White House level, and it's going to have to be pressure from the bottom, I think, ultimately. So that's why your show is so important. That's why, you know, getting the word out about this issue that wouldn't ordinarily fall in, you know, come to mind in day-to-day activity, but it's a strategic problem. It's gotten a little bit more comfortable over the last 2 years, but starting 2+ years ago, when I would call money managers and say ESG is garbage, they would just about slam the phone down on me. Now it's at least we're engaging in some conversation. We are finding some money managers out there who recognize it, at least off the record, as garbage, and are telling me that they're utilizing fundamentals, which is a funny thing. We're actually coded as ESG because we take out these bad guys. We look nothing like an ESG fund, of course. We call ourselves National Security Governance, NSG, but we're considered one of the socially responsible investing bucket. So we may be the only ESG fund that you could actually approve. Well, that'll be an interesting first, and but I do want to interject just for sort of frame of reference for the people that listen to this show. I've been saying for a long time, as I say, defund the woke and know where you donate, invest, and spend, etc., I reference bullets. And if you were at war, and I frankly believe that we are at a new type of war, it's called 5th generation warfare. See also How to Defeat America Without Firing a Single Shot, and read up on the two generals. There's all kinds of stuff there. I keep sort of dropping these breadcrumbs, and I hope that some people actually do some research and read up on these things. They're fundamentally important. But one of the things that I've said through the last couple of years of finding this unwoke voice is, if you were at war, would you want to fund bullets for your enemy? And we certainly do that. It's meant to be sort of metaphorical. But in this context, with what we're talking about today with Justin Bernier and the National Security Index, it's absolutely true. And it's more than bullets. You're talking about bombs and missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBM, etc. So I really hope that this sort of is a flashpoint of recognition for people, because let's look at the positive. Let's look at where I'm hoping that we all go.
and that is exactly what Justin outlined here. And that is, if we are successful at pushing back and fighting back against this movement, this use of our money, our U.S. hard-earned retirement dollars in pensions, endowments, foundations, retirement plans, etc., if we can stop the bad guys from using our money to fund these things that harm us, we could pretty quickly defund the woke.
Yeah, the sub-advisor issue. If we're looking at index funds that cover emerging markets, 85% of them fall under the big three. And so even if you're in a Fidelity or you're in something, you may actually be benchmarked to the same bench that BlackRock or Vanguard is using. MSCI is the index provider in the case of BlackRock, and so on and so forth. So they're all there's very few independent asset managers out there, truly independent. We're like 85 to 90% of it is this oligarchy, the marriage of the big asset managers and the index providers. And so, it does help, I think, as an investor or an advisor, take a look, see what are you benchmarked to? What is this index tracking? Is it the same thing as what BlackRock is using or Vanguard? Am I just getting a different name brand on the front there? And that's oftentimes the case in the index world.
Sort of for people who are looking for at a glance view of the wokeness, if you will, that's not actually a thing. Although I have thought about developing a wokeometer. Looking at what your investments are benchmarked to is a great start. At the end of the day, though, ultimately it's what you own. So you don't get stuck or hung up on the name or the issuer. If it's some sort of great sounding, flowery, wonderful sounding money manager, and they have a really great sounding mutual fund name, that doesn't matter if when we drill down and look at what they're actually invested in, if it's a whole bunch of Target, BlackRock, Vanguard, if they're invested in those companies, Bank of America, Disney, and Anheuser-Busch, which is the parent company of Bud Light, all those investments we've been talking about through the years. So ultimately, just remember, we need to sort of get to that base layer. What is it actually that they're invested in? And we can get into the weeds there, and that's kind of off topic for today's conversation, but I wanted to interject that. Justin, I want to give you the last word. Tell us where people can find you and what future plans you have for your team.
Yeah, nationalsecurityindex.com is our website. Folks can get information about NSI, which is the fund, and it's the National Security Emerging Markets Index ETF. So we're going to give you a broad emerging markets, like I said, without the bad guys. Where we go from here, I think there's an institutional future for this. The institutions can be very finicky. They don't want to invest in anything that has been around for at least 3 years. But we're coming up on that point, our underlying index, where we'll have that track record. And we're trying to not only give retail clients and advisors a third way, a better way, but we're trying to change the way that institutions invest so that we can change the way that this whole direction is going. So I would envision an institutional offering of this strategy in the not distant future.
Beautiful. So it's important to remember, everybody, that as you consider building your portfolio, if you're choosing pooled investments, things like exchange traded funds, and what we've been discussing today is an exchange traded fund. Anything where you have a pool of investments, consider it as a component of your portfolio. I would not suggest an entire investment in this ETF, and I hope that Justin would agree with me on this, but consider it as a component of your portfolio. Consider getting emerging markets, and by all means, please defund the left. We want to diss the globalists. Know where you donate, invest, and spend. Let's do more of this type of conversation, looking at where our money ultimately ends up. Is it ending up in far left companies, causes, or countries? The more we can eliminate that, the sooner we can reclaim America. I'm Jonathan Broadbent. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of UnWoke.Academy. Thanks for joining me, Justin.
Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate it.